Hello and welcome to the second installment of the FL Studio Basic Production Tutorial series. In this part, I will be teaching you the basics of sound synthesis in Sylenth1 by LennarDigital. When you first open up Sylenth1, it might look a little bit confusing, but hopefully by the end of this tutorial you will understand more about how it works and will be quite confident in using it to design your own sounds for your own music. When we first open it up, we can see the first thing that pops up are the amount of knobs. We will ignore those for now and we will look at the top menu. At the top we have the polyphony. This is the amount of notes that can be played at any given time. Right now it's at 3, so the maximum amount of notes that I can play is 3. Any more than that and it will start to cancel out existing notes. If you're playing chords, I recommend putting this high. If you're playing single note melodies, you might want to put it lower. This is due to the fact that more voices equals more strain on your processor, and so if you have a computer that might not have the state-of-the-art processor that is recommended, you most likely will want to keep this low to preserve CPU power. Here we can see an indicator for the voices that are playing, and next to that there are different part selections. This is a two-part synthesizer, with part A and part B working completely independently from each other. This can be used to your advantage to create really interesting stacked sounds. And if you want to listen to any of the parts by themselves, you can simply select the part that you want to listen to and press the solo button next to it to isolate the other part out. Moving down to the oscillator tab. In every single part, that is part A and part B, there are two oscillators. They both work exactly the same and can be used to create layers of sound to create a more interesting overall sound. Let's look at oscillator A1. The first thing that we will talk about is the wave. How this synthesizer works is it has some built-in core sounds, and using these knobs it can change the parameters of the sound and tweak it. This is known as subtractive synthesis. Here you have a variety of pre-programmed sounds. You have a saw wave, a triangle wave, a pulse wave or a square wave, an H pulse wave, a Q pulse wave, a tri-saw, and a noise wave. The noise might sound slightly strange. This is used to give depth to basses and add a more interesting effect to different sounds if used in small quantities. We will stick with a saw wave for now. On the right you can see a voices box. In this box you can select the amount of voices that are playing your given note. At this time there's only one voice. More voices equals a louder and stronger sound. For now we will leave it at 1, but we will change this later on to demonstrate some other parameters. On the right there is a retrigger box. What this means is that every single time you play a note, when it is checked, it will retrigger the note from the beginning of the waveform, which is seen here. If you uncheck it, it will not retrigger the note and it will play it from the position that the note stopped playing at last. I recommend leaving this on for the most part. On the very left we can see a pitch tab. Here we can see a box labeled octave and a box labeled note. Changing the number in the octave box will give a sound that is higher or lower in terms of octaves. If you do not know what an octave is, please refer to the next part of the tutorial series. Similarly, the note box can be used to change the note that is playing. Below this you can see a knob that is labeled fine. This is fine pitch. This could be used to create small adjustments to the pitch of the note. The second oscillator works the exact same way, and if you want to copy settings from one oscillator to the other, you simply need to press the C on one of the oscillator with the desired parameters and press the P on the second oscillator. Let us move to the parameters that can be seen here, the knobs. Let me just silence this one. In the first oscillator, the volume naturally controls the volume of the wave. Phase controls the phase of different voices playing the wave at the same time. And detune can detune voices from each other. Allow me to demonstrate. Right now, this pitched the voices differently and created a very interesting sounding effect. If we want, we can further modulate this using the phase knob. Stereo controls the stereo spread of the sound. If it is low, it'll create a very shallow, weak sounding monotone. And if it is all the way up, it'll create a very wide stereo sounding tone. The pan knob can change the pan position of the sound. That is the basics of how oscillators work. We will now move on to the amplitude envelope. This is again separate in part A and part B, however settings from one can be copied to the other using the copy and paste buttons. Here there are 4 sliders. They are labeled ADSR. They stand for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Allow me to show you what every single slider does. The first slider, the attack slider, controls the amount of time it takes until the loudest part of a note hits. With a low attack like this one, it'll hit immediately. However, if we raise the attack, you can see what happens. It gives it more of a fade-in look, and for progressive bass lines, this is a very good effect to use. In order to properly demonstrate what decay does, I had to change some parameters. What decay does is it changes the amount of decay that there will be after the attack hits. With very low decay, it goes directly to the sustain, sounding like this. With a high decay, it glides down to the sustain and is much louder. You can hear that when the attack hits, it is louder, after which it proceeds to decay. Sustain controls the volume that is sustained after the decay happens. Naturally, a smaller sustain value means a quieter sound. Release is essentially the opposite of attack. It is the amount of time it takes for a note to completely fade out after it has been released. A low release will mean that there is no release time whatsoever and it is instantaneous. Raising this, however, will create a very interesting effect. Next, we can move on to the filter tab. Yet again, the filter is independent in part A and part B, at least the first one. This filter has a variety of different types. The first is a bypass. This type of filter does absolutely nothing to the sound. The second type of filter that there is a low pass, which takes out all of the higher frequencies that the sound may have. Next one is a band pass filter, which takes out the low frequencies and the high frequencies. And the last is a high pass type of filter, which takes out only the lower frequencies, leaving the higher ones intact. I will set it to a low pass filter for now. Here you can select the input that you have into the filter. You can select it to apply to oscillator A or oscillator B and A at the same time, or none of them if you want. I will just select A for the moment. Cutoff controls the amount of filter that is applied to the oscillator, as can be heard here. A very high cutoff means less filter, a low cutoff means that there is more filter applied. Resonance gives a resonant quality to the tone. And drive is a boost in volume as well as some slightly added distortion. This can be good for making your sound really big on top of the mix. We can then move on to the mixer. The mixer can control the different volumes of both part A and part B at once. Allow me to demonstrate. I will set part B to a square wave. I will give it a voice, and now they play simultaneously. Lowering the volume of mix A will allow me to hear more of B, and doing the same to B will allow me to hear more of A. This can be used to control the different levels of both A and B in your mix. The main volume controls the volume of the entire synthesizer. Next, we move on to filter control. This is a global parameter. This parameter allows us to control the amount of filter applied to both A and B. This does not differ from part A to part B. It is the same for both of them. If you change one in the other one is changed as well. For this to be demonstrated, I need to first apply a filter to part B. I will apply a low pass once again. As can be heard, moving the cutoff lower moves the cutoff for both part A and part B. The resonance is the same, and key tracking can be used to apply different volumes of filter to different notes depending on the note pressed. It is a very interesting effect to mess around with. Warm drive, when checked, applies a warm drive to the sound. It has a very subtle difference, however it can be used very effectively. We next move on to the browser window / the effects window. This is how you will be navigating around Sylenth1. You have 4 numbers here, and when clicking on them it loads different sound banks. By default, you will have sound banks that look like this. Clicking on the bar up here will allow you to see all the sounds in the sound bank and select them accordingly. Using the arrows on the very right of the bar will allow you to change the sound used to the next one available. Similar to this, if you click on the menu tab, you can see preset controls. You can load presets, save presets, load banks, save them, export them. You can also copy and paste presets, and you can also do this cool feature called randomize, which completely randomizes all of the parameters in Sylenth1, creating some interesting sounds which sometimes can be quite useful. For now, I will go back to the initial preset. Here we can see the effects that we can add. There is an arpeggiator, distortion, a phaser, chorus, an equalizer, delay, reverb or reverberation, and a compressor. Let's start with the arpeggiator. As the name suggests, the arpeggiator allows us to use it as a sort of step sequencer to influence the sound. When turned on, it can be modulated and it can have some very interesting effects if used properly. Changing the time makes it faster. Changing the gate allows the notes to be longer or shorter. Generally, I recommend that you stay away from this effect unless you're performing live due to the fact that it is quite limiting. I prefer to draw my notes in manually, however, if that is not the case for you, feel free to use it at your own will. Next is distortion. As the name suggests, this distorts the sound. Clicking on the box in the middle allows us to select the type of distortion used, and I strongly recommend using them individually and learning to know what they each sound like. I will use a bit crusher. Amount controls the intensity of the distortion that is applied, and dry wet controls the amount of that intensity that you apply to the effect. Allow me to demonstrate. In harsher genres of music such as dubstep, this is a very useful effect to use. Next, we move on to the phaser. This is a complicated effect to explain, and I will not be going over all the parameters due to shortages of time. However, I will be going over the main ones. Dry-wet, once again, is the amount of effect that is applied. The width is the width of the effect that you apply. Feedback is the amount of phaser feedback that you get when you apply the effect. And an LFO is known as a low-frequency oscillator, which can be used to change the speed of the effect. Let me show you. Using gain on the LFO allows you to have a much more wider effect. The parameters in the chorus can be applied similarly. Rate makes it a faster effect, and depth can be used to make the effect deeper or shallower. Of course, dry-wet works the same way as it always does. An equalizer is something that can be used to equalize your sounds within the synthesizer without the use of external equalizers. Allow me to show you. To properly equalize, we can select the frequency. In this case, I want to select the bass frequency, even though this is a quite high sound. I will select a frequency at 242 Hz. Then, using the knob to the left of it, I can select how much or how little of the frequency that I selected I want. Let me show you. This is a great way to isolate or bring out frequencies in the certain frequency spectrum. You can change the mode as well. Next we go on to delay. This is a very important one for all genres of music, especially house. When enabled, this will apply an effect that causes the sound to delay back and forth between your ears by default. This is what it sounds like. If you do not want it to bounce back and forth between your ears, you can simply uncheck the ping pong box and it'll be in the front of the stereo spectrum without going left and right anymore. You can mess around with the parameters for both left and right to create some very interesting delay sounds. You can do high cuts and low cuts with the knobs to the right of that. You can do a very stereo spread, and you can also control dry-wet yet again. Reverb is another very important one. This is essentially an echo. The width and the dry-wet should be pretty self-explanatory and should size. Again, you will have to experiment with these parameters more on your own to fully understand what they do, and to get a better understanding of what the synthesizer can do, I recommend that you do that. Combining reverb with delay creates very interesting effects. Next we move on to the last of the effects, which is a compressor. This is difficult to explain scientifically, however what it does in layman's terms is it takes the sound and it compresses it, making it punchier and louder and stands out much more in the mix. If you use this for leads and whatnot, it can have a very effective outcome. It simply makes the sound much louder. Lastly, we can move on to the modulation envelopes and the modulation LFOs. This is the most complicated part of Sylenth, so pay attention. Here we can modulate certain parameters inside of Sylenth1 using envelopes like we did up here. Except this is not just for volume, like this one. This can be used for every parameter in the synthesizer. I will select pitch of part A. And we can see here that we have the same ADSR labels as we have on the amplitude envelope. Moving this knob controls the amount of the pitch that is affected, because we selected pitch in this case. And attack, delay, sustain, and release work in the same way, only not with amplitude or volume. but with the parameter that we selected. We can select two parameters to affect at once. However, I will not do that for now because this is enough of a demonstration. Modulation envelopes 1 and 2 work the same way and they are completely separate from each other. Similarly, LFO 1 and 2 work very similar to that as well. You can select the effect that you want to modulate with the low frequency oscillator. In this case, I will be using the pitch once more and I will turn this one off. And using the rate, you can select the rate at which the LFO takes place. Using the gain, changes the amount of LFO that is applied. Up here, you can also change the wave of the LFO. That pretty much covers how LFO1 and LFO2 work. Miscellaneous is a more difficult explanation, and I will not be going over what miscellaneous 1 and 2 do in this tutorial for the sake of simplicity. You do not need to know what they do, you can still make great sounds without using them. If you want to experiment with them, feel free. However, I don't really use them too much, and so I don't really see the point of explaining to you what they do. Here we have the very last piece of explanation that I need to do for the synthesizer. We have the portamento window. This is an effect that is very commonly used in most modern genres of music. As you can see, you have a big knob labeled portamento, mono legato as a button, and then you have a normal and slide switch. As you can imagine, the portamento knob controls the amount of portamento you add to your sound. By default, it is at normal, and what portamento is it slides between notes. It is currently doing strange things because the LFO is still on. If you want to play more than one note at once, you have to leave mono legato off. However, I would leave it on. As you can imagine, the more portamento you add, the bigger the slide. This effect can be used to create uplifters, and it can also be used to create really nice effects on synths. If you do not want this to work as it does right now, where you can still separate notes if you do not play them both at once, you can select the slide mode, where it will slide between notes regardless of whether two notes are pressed at once or not. I need to put the portamento value up for this to be evident. If it was on normal, they would not slide unless the notes were played at once. That concludes the tutorial for how to use Sylenth1. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you stuck around for the rest of the parts. If you enjoyed the tutorial, I would appreciate some feedback in the comment section or in a private message. This is currently a project in development, and so I would greatly appreciate feedback. I thank you for paying attention throughout this entire tutorial, and join me next time where I'll be talking about music theory, song arrangements, and further music production techniques.